An aristocratic wife never lowers herself to fight a homewrecker. She simply lets the corporate machine do the butchering. Lizabeth Scott spent 10 years as the glamorous secret toy of mogul Hal Wallis, fatally mistaking his lust for leverage. When a tabloid scandal threatened his wealth, his billionaire wife Louise Fazenda watched in absolute silence as the cowardly mogul legally eradicated his mistress overnight. She'd been entirely blinded by the sheer scale of the empire he commanded. Hal B. Wallis projected the image of an untouchable, hard-driving executive. Operating under the massive umbrella of Paramount Pictures, he controlled multi-million-dollar budgets. He possessed the authority to manufacture a global icon overnight, and the power to bury an actor so deep they would never be seen again. But the public image of a powerful man is often a carefully constructed facade designed to mask a profound internal weakness. The true locus of power in Hal Wallis's life was not his corner office at Paramount. The true power resided in his home, tightly gripped in the hands of his legal wife, Louise Fazenda. Louise Fazenda was an anomaly in the patriarchal structure of mid-century Los Angeles. She was not a trophy wife plucked from a chorus line to serve as a decorative accessory for a studio executive. Fazenda was a foundational pillar of the industry itself. In the 1920s, she had been a massive star of silent film comedy, working under Mack Sennett, while other silent stars squandered their fortunes on lavish parties and depreciating assets. Fazenda possessed the cold, calculating mind of a Wall Street banker. She invested her massive earnings heavily in Southern California real estate. By the time she married Hal Wallis in 1927, she was independently wealthy. She did not need his money. She did not need his industry connections. When the transition to sound cinema ended her acting career, Fazenda simply transitioned into the role of Hollywood aristocracy. She became one of the most formidable social brokers in the city. Her philanthropic work, her extensive real estate holdings, and her razor-sharp intellect made her untouchable. Her marriage to Hal Wallis functioned less as a romantic union and more as a high-level corporate merger. Fazenda provided the old money respectability and the impenetrable social armor that Wallis, a man obsessed with his own legacy, desperately craved. She understood the brutal mechanics of capitalism perfectly. She knew that in a city built on physical desire, husbands would inevitably stray. But Fazenda did not view infidelity through the lens of emotional betrayal. She viewed it through the lens of asset management. A mistress was a temporary expenditure. The marriage certificate was the core holding. She possessed the bank accounts, the social standing, and the legal monopoly on the Wallis name. She could afford to be magnanimous because she knew she held the keys to the vault. Into this deeply entrenched, highly fortified corporate marriage walked Lizabeth Scott. She was 27 years younger than Louise Fazenda. While the wife held the financial architecture of Hollywood, Lizabeth arrived not as an industry veteran, but as raw material. She possessed a specific, highly marketable physical architecture. She had the heavy-lidded eyes of a predator, a stark, symmetrical bone structure, and a voice that sounded like it had been dragged through gravel and whiskey. It was a voice that projected danger, sexual availability, and profound cynicism. In the mid-1940s, the cinematic landscape was shifting toward film noir, and audiences were hungry for the femme fatale. They wanted women who looked like they could destroy a man. Hal Wallis saw Lizabeth Scott and immediately recognized a high-yield asset. He bought her contract. He groomed her, molded her, and initiated a massive publicity campaign designed to frame her as the successor to Lauren Bacall. He cast her in dark, psychological thrill. Years. He put her face on billboards. He manufactured a star. But Wallis did not just want to profit from Lizabeth Scott on the screen. He wanted to own her entirely. He initiated an affair that would define the next decade of her life. Lizabeth Scott fell into the trap that destroys countless women who enter into asymmetrical power dynamics. She confused sexual access with actual leverage. Because Wallis desired her physically, because he gave her leading roles, she believed she possessed a measure of control over the titan of Paramount Pictures. She believed that her youth, her breathtaking beauty, and her on-screen magnetism made her a genuine threat to his marriage. She was completely wrong. The arrangement that Hal Wallis established was not a romance. It was a highly organized, heavily compartmentalized containment strategy. Lizabeth Scott was installed as a shadow asset. For 10 years, she existed in a state of suspended animation, living out a daily reality of profound humiliation. The mechanics of the affair were dictated entirely by Wallis's need to protect his marriage to Fazenda. Lizabeth was never allowed to step into the light. There were no public dinners at Chasen's or Romanoff's. There were no shared premieres. Every encounter was a covert operation. Wallis utilized the logistical infrastructure of the studio to hide her. He arranged for tinted cars, back entrances, and isolated safe houses. Lizabeth was forced to navigate her own life like a fugitive. She was a globally recognized film star, a woman whose face was plastered across magazine covers worldwide. Yet her personal existence was relegated to the margins. The psychological toll of this existence was devastating. Lizabeth Scott was living a paradox. On the sound stages, she portrayed powerful, manipulative women who brought men to their knees. In her private life, she was completely subservient. She waited by the telephone for Wallis to call. She rearranged her schedule to accommodate his narrow windows of availability. She existed entirely on his terms. And looming over every clandestine meeting, every whispered promise, was the terrifying silent presence of Louise Fazenda. Fazenda knew about Lizabeth Scott. In the tight-knit, heavily surveilled ecosystem of the Hollywood elite, it was impossible to keep an affair of that duration a complete secret. The executives knew, the fixers knew, the wives knew. But Louise Fazenda executed a masterclass in psychological warfare. She chose absolute arrogant silence. She did not hire private investigators to burst into hotel rooms. She did not leak stories to the gossip columnists. She did not demand that Wallis fire Lizabeth. To acknowledge the mistress would be to validate the mistress's existence. Fazenda refused to grant Lizabeth that dignity. Fazenda's silence was not a sign of weakness. It was a demonstration of overwhelming power. By doing nothing, Fazenda communicated to the entire industry and to Lizabeth herself that the affair was utterly irrelevant. The mistress was a non-entity, a temporary distraction. Every time Lizabeth opened a newspaper and saw a photograph of Hal Wallis and Louise Fazenda attending a high society gala, standing arm in arm, projecting the image of a unified aristocratic dynasty, the knife twisted deeper. Fazenda possessed the legal right to stand beside the man. Fazenda possessed the right to inherit his wealth. Fazenda possessed the respect of the studio heads and the political elite. Lizabeth possessed nothing but a secret. The disparity in leverage was absolute. Lizabeth generated millions of dollars for Hal Wallis Productions. Her face sold the tickets. Her body was the product. But the profits she generated were funneled directly into the corporate structure controlled by Wallis and Fazenda. The homewrecker was effectively subsidizing the marriage she was trying to dismantle. This was the brutal reality of the love prison. Lizabeth Scott was trapped in a system of her own and making, blinded by the illusion that her physical beauty could eventually outweigh the structural power of a legal marriage. She endured the indignity of the back doors and the secret apartments because she believed that Wallis would eventually leave his wife. She believed the lie that men in power always tell the women they keep in the shadows. But Wallis was never going to leave Louise Fazenda. He was terrified of her. He relied on her social capital. He respected her financial independence. He viewed his wife as an equal partner in a corporate empire. He viewed Lizabeth Scott as leased equipment. You do not dismantle a corporation to marry a piece of equipment. For 10 years, Lizabeth Scott absorbed this humiliation. She swallowed the indignity of being a hidden woman. She allowed her prime years, her beauty, and her talent to be harvested by a man who refused to acknowledge her in the daylight. She believed she could outlast the wife. She believed she could win the war of attrition. She did not realize that the rules of engagement in Hollywood were heavily rigged against the unprotected. She did not realize that a mistress is only tolerated as long as she remains a silent, frictionless asset. The moment a mistress becomes a public liability, the system will mobilize to eradicate her with terrifying speed. Lizabeth Scott had survived a decade in the dark. But the darkness was about to be violently ripped away by the flashbulbs of the most predatory publication in America. The illusion of her safety and the illusion of Hal Wallis's protection was about to be shattered in a public execution that would leave her utterly destroyed. Hollywood discarded its stars publicly. The apex predator of this new era was Confidential magazine. In the repressive, intensely paranoid climate of 1955 America, Confidential weaponized the truth. And the most lethal truth a tabloid could print was the implication of homosexuality. It was a professional death sentence from which there was no appeal. In September 1955, Confidential magazine loaded this weapon and aimed it directly at the head of Lizabeth Scott. The magazine published a sensational, heavily detailed article alleging that during a police raid on a high-end Hollywood call girl ring, detectives discovered a little black book belonging to a woman named Holly Rowe. Rowe was accused of operating a network of lesbian sex workers. According to Confidential, Lizabeth Scott's name and private telephone number were prominently listed in that book. The article did not explicitly state that Scott was a client or a participant, but in the brutal shorthand of 1950s tabloid journalism, the implication was an absolute, fatal conviction. The headline screamed her name. The magazines vanished from the newsstands within hours. For 10 years, Lizabeth Scott had endured the suffocating humiliation of the love prison. She had accepted the back doors, the secrecy, and the degrading reality of being a hidden mistress. She had allowed her prime years to be harvested by Hal Wallis because she believed in an unwritten contract. She provided the silence, and the studio provided the shield. When the Confidential issue hit the streets of Los Angeles, Lizabeth Scott waited for the shield to be deployed. She retreated to her home and waited for the telephone to ring. She anticipated the standard ruthless deployment of the Paramount Pictures crisis management machine. She expected Hal Wallis to mobilize the studio's legal department, to issue aggressive threats of libel against Robert Harrison, to dispatch fixers to intimidate the witnesses, and to orchestrate a massive counter-narrative in the compliant trade papers. This was the protocol. This was how the system protected its investments. Lizabeth had generated millions of dollars for Hal Wallis Productions. She had been his loyal, silent shadow for a decade. She assumed her loyalty had purchased her immunity. She fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the MMA on she served. Inside the executive suites of Paramount Pictures, Hal Wallis was reading the same magazine. He was not looking at the destruction of a woman he loved. He was looking at a catastrophic liability matrix. Wallis was a man who projected an aura of absolute, uncompromising authority. He was the producer who had stood toe-to-toe with Humphrey Bogart, Bette Davis, and Errol Flynn. He cultivated the image of a fearless, hard-boiled titan of industry. But the confidential article exposed a terrifying vulnerability. If Wallis mobilized the Paramount legal team to defend Lizabeth Scott, he would immediately and publicly link himself to a radioactive sex scandal. Defending her meant initiating a brutal, highly publicized legal war with Confidential. During the discovery phase of a libel lawsuit, the lawyers for the magazine would possess the legal right to subpoena witnesses, demand hotel records, and depose studio employees under oath. The 10-year affair between the powerful producer and his leading lady, hidden so carefully in the shadows, would be dragged into the unforgiving light of a courtroom. And waiting in the center of that light was Louise Fazenda. The calculation that Hal Wallis made in that moment reveals the reality of studio power dynamics. Wallis looked at the balance sheet of his life. On one side was Lizabeth Scott, a fading femme fatale, a mistress who had suddenly become a focal point of a federal-level morality scandal, a woman whose box office returns were already beginning to diminish. On the other side was Louise Fazenda, a woman of immense personal wealth, a pillar of Los Angeles high society, a matriarch who commanded the respect of the studio heads, the politicians, and the financial backers of his production company. Fazenda was the foundation of his empire. Her money, her real estate, and her immaculate reputation provided the essential armor that Wallis required to operate at the highest levels of the Hollywood syndicate. If the ABBFE heir was exposed in a messy public trial surrounding a lesbian prostitution ring, the humiliation for Louise Fazenda would be absolute. The aristocratic facade of their marriage would be destroyed. Fazenda, a woman who did not tolerate embarrassment, possessed the legal and financial capability to dismantle Hal Wallis Productions overnight. She could freeze assets. She could demand a divorce settlement that would strip him of his wealth. She could turn the entire social establishment of Beverly Hills against him. Faced with the choice between protecting the woman he had sexually exploited for a decade or protecting the billionaire wife who anchored his corporate authority, Hal Wallis did not hesitate. He chose his own survival. He executed the savage betrayal. The betrayal was not a dramatic confrontation. It was not a screaming argument in a studio office. The most lethal corporate assassinations are conducted in absolute silence. Hal Wallis simply severed the connection. He issued a silent directive to the Paramount legal department, stand down. He instructed his secretaries to stop routing her calls. He placed a total embargo on her access to the executive floor. When Lizabeth Scott picked up the telephone to beg for help, there was no answer. The man who had controlled her life, dictated her career, and monopolized her body for 10 years, vanished completely. This was the bloody 0 hour. The sheer suffocating terror of that silence is difficult to quantify. Lizabeth Scott woke up as a globally recognized movie star, expecting the full military intervention of a major Hollywood studio. She went to sleep as an isolated radioactive pariah. Wallis's cowardice was total. He did not just refuse to provide legal counsel, He actively signaled to the entire industry that Lizabeth Scott was no longer under his protection. In Hollywood, power is perceived through association. When the industry observed that Hal Wallis had abandoned his most famous asset, the shark's eye dightly began to circle. The gossip columnists, who normally required studio permission to attack a major star, realized the leash had been removed. They descended on Lizabeth, amplifying the confidential rumors, shredding her reputation daily. By retreating behind the skirts of Louise Fazenda, Hal Wallis committed an act of supreme masculine cowardice. He had spent his career manufacturing films about brave, stoic men who stood up to corruption and defended the weak. Yet when his own empire was threatened, he sacrificed his mistress as a disposable pawn. He threw her into the media incinerator to ensure that the smoke did not drift over the walls of his Brentwood estate. Wallis preserved his marriage and his money, but history permanently unmasked him. The facade of the tough, uncompromising kingmaker disintegrated. He was revealed as a parasite. He was a man who derived his ultimate authority not from his own spine, but from his wife's bank account. He was willing to use a woman's body to generate millions, but he was unwilling to risk a single dollar of his own capital to save her life. Lizabeth Scott was left completely exposed. She had no husband to protect her. She had no independent fortune to fund a private defense. She had alienated potential allies during her years as Wallis's exclusive property. She was standing alone on the precipice of absolute professional annihilation. The standard studio procedure for an actor caught in a fatal scandal was to flee. The studio would usually arrange for the actor to quietly break their contract, travel to Europe, and disappear until the public memory faded. They were expected to accept their destruction with quiet compliance. But Lizabeth Scott was not a standard contract player. She was a woman who had spent 10 years swallowing the bitter pill of the love prison. She had endured a decade of subservience. The sudden, brutal realization that she had been used and discarded by the man she trusted triggered a desperate, feral reaction. She realized that she had nothing left to lose. Her career was already dead. Her reputation was already in ruins. If Hal Wallis would not defend her, she would defend herself. In a move that stunned the industry and terrified the executives at Paramount, Lizabeth Scott refused to run. She refused to hide in Europe. She hired her own legal counsel, drawing on her own depleted savings, and filed a massive $2.5 million defamation lawsuit directly against Robert Harrison and Confidential magazine. It was an act of staggering, suicidal bravery. By filing the lawsuit, Lizabeth forced the issue into the courts. She guaranteed that the scandal would not quietly fade away. She ensured that the allegations would be debated, scrutinized, and recorded in the public ledger of a California courtroom. She thought she was fighting for her dignity. She thought she was using the legal system to clear her name and force the industry to respect her. She did not realize that by stepping into that courtroom without the iron hand of the studio to protect her, she was walking directly into a slaughterhouse. She was about to discover that the cruelty of Confidential magazine was nothing compared to the sadistic, systemic violence of the American legal system when it is unleashed upon an unprotected woman. The trial was not going to be a search for the truth. It was going to be a public autopsy. And the men who ran Paramount Pictures, including the man who had shared her bed for 10 years, were going to sit comfortably in their offices and watch her be dismantled piece by piece. The withdrawal of protection was only the first phase of the betrayal. The second phase was the active, coordinated corporate erasure that would ensure Lizabeth Scott never worked in a motion picture again. The courtroom doors swung open. Lizabeth Scott stepped inside. She was completely alone. In the hierarchy of the Golden Age, a studio star never saw the inside of a courtroom unless the stew. Dio orchestrated the narrative. If a star was arrested, the corporate fixers arrived before the police booked them. If a star sued, the studio's elite legal division drafted the papers, intimidated the opposing witnesses, and manipulated the judge. Lizabeth Scott possessed none of this infrastructure. She had initiated a $2.5 million defamation lawsuit against Robert Harrison and his tabloid empire, but she was fighting a mechanized war without armor. The defense strategy deployed by Confidential magazine was brilliant and entirely predatory. In a defamation lawsuit in the 1950s, the burden of proof rested heavily on the plaintiff. The defense did not need to prove their article was absolutely true. They only needed to prove that the plaintiff's reputation was already compromised, or they needed to muddy the waters so thoroughly that the jury could not decipher the truth. The defense attorneys were not looking for justice. They were executing a character assassination under oath. When Lizabeth Scott took the witness stand, she was subjected to a psychological butchery. The opposing counsel utilized words like surgical scalpels. They did not ask about her acting career, her box office receipts, or her artistic contributions to Paramount Pictures. They asked about her private movements. They interrogated her regarding the addresses she visited, the people she associated with there in the dead of night, and the exact nature of her relationships. In the suffocating, intensely homophobic atmosphere of the McCarthy era, simply being forced to answer these questions in a public forum was a form of profound degradation. The lawyers peeled back the layers of her life with sadistic precision. They demanded explanations for her whereabouts on specific dates. These were dates when she was likely sequestered in a safe house waiting for Hal Wallis. But she could not use Hal Wallis as an alibi. She could not reveal the 10-year affair that had defined her existence. Osing the married production chief of Paramount Pictures would trigger a corporate retaliation even more lethal than the tabloid scandal. She was trapped in a perjury matrix. She had to defend her honor while simultaneously protecting the man who had abandoned her to the wolves. She was absorbing the legal blows meant for the entire corrupt system. The press gallery documented every hesitation, every tremor in her voice, every drop of sweat that broke through her makeup. The courtroom was packed with spectators who had come to watch a goddess bleed. Lizabeth Scott, the woman who played Ruthless, calculating predators on the silver screen, was being methodically dismantled in real time. The cross-examination was designed to break her mind. It was a prolonged, violent, public shaming masquerading as legal procedure. The most devastating element of this ordeal was the empty space behind the plaintiff's table. Hal Wallis was not there. The executives from Paramount were not there. The silence from the studio was absolute. This physical absence was an act of communication to the judge, the jury, and the press corps. It was a clear, unmistakable signal. This woman is no longer under our protection. She is surplus inventory. You may proceed with the liquidation. While Lizabeth Scott was being flayed alive in the Los Angeles courthouse, the corporate machinery at Paramount Pictures was quietly, efficiently severing her lifeline. Hal Wallis did not merely retreat from the scandal. He actively participated in her professional execution. The studio system possessed a fail-safe mechanism designed specifically for these scenarios. It was called the Morals Clause. Embedded in every standard contract, the Morals Clause granted the studio the absolute right to terminate an actor if their conduct brought them into public disrepute, contempt, scandal, or ridicule. The clause was intentionally vague. It did not require a criminal conviction. It did not require undeniable proof of guilt. It only required bad publicity. Paramount Pictures invoked the morals clause against Lizabeth Scott. The very studio that had manufactured her image, the studio run by the man who had kept her as a secret mistress for a decade, used the scandal as a legal guillotine. The studio lawyers, the men who were previously tasked with negotiating her multi-picture deals, drafted her termination papers. They ripped up her contracts. They confiscated the scripts that had been developed specifically for her. They sent memos to the casting departments across the lot. Lizabeth Scott is banned. This is the true nature of the savage betrayal. Hal Wallis did not just leave her to fight the tabloid alone. He helped lock the cage. He utilized the corporate structure to ensure that she could never return to the lot and demand accountability. By firing her, Paramount distanced itself from the contagion of the lawsuit. They preserved their stock price. They preserved the immaculate reputation of Louise Fazenda. The mistress was successfully excised from the corporate body before the infection could spread to the boardroom. The lawsuit against Confidential magazine eventually ended in a legal limbo. The proceedings collapsed into a mistrial. For a Hollywood star fighting a morality scandal in 1955, a mistrial is not an exoneration. It is a death sentence. A mistrial means the accusations remain unresolved. The stain becomes permanent. The public is left with a lingering suspicion, and in a consumer-driven industry, suspicion is enough to kill box office returns. Lizabeth Scott walked out of the courthouse financially depleted and professionally annihilated. She had spent her savings paying private attorneys to fight a war she could not win. The defamation suit had achieved the exact opposite of its intended goal. Instead of clearing her name, it had permanently linked her identity to the scandal. The tabloid won not by securing a legal victory, but by ensuring the destruction of her marketability. The aftermath was a cold, silent void. The telephone stopped ringing. The scripts stopped arriving. The directors who used to praise her smoky voice and her magnetic presence suddenly refused to take her calls. She was blacklisted. It was an invisible, unspoken blacklist, enforced by the collective cowardice of the studio executives. No producer wanted to risk their own capital or the wrath of Hal Wallis by hiring a woman who had been branded as toxic merchandise. Lizabeth Scott, the ultimate femme fatale, the woman who had defined the aesthetic of film noir for a generation, was completely and systematically eradicated from the golden age of Hollywood. Her prime generating years had been harvested, and the husk was discarded. She was forced into a profound involuntary isolation, living out the rest of her life in obscurity, forever defined by a scandal she could not defeat, and a man who refused to stand by her. The contrast between her fate and the fate of the couple she had served is the final, sickening punchline of the Hollywood syndicate. Hal Wallis and Louise Fazenda suffered absolutely no consequences. They did not lose a single dollar of their immense fortune. They did not lose a single invitation to the exclusive Beverly Hills dinner parties. Wallis continued to produce massive, lucrative motion pictures. He continued to be celebrated as a visionary kingmaker. Fazenda continued to reign over Los Angeles high society, her reputation completely insulated by the sheer density of her wealth and her marriage certificate. The system functioned exactly as it was designed to function. The corporate marriage absorbed the shock. The mistress absorbed the damage. The destruction of Lizabeth Scott proved the most unforgiving law of the Hollywood hierarchy. You can possess breathtaking beauty. You can possess immense talent. You can generate millions of dollars at the box office. You can even share the bed of the most powerful man in the industry. But you are never an equal. You are leased property. The moment your presence threatens the core assets of the corporation, the moment you become a legal or public relations liability, the men who exploited you will unite with the wives who ignored you. They will deploy their lawyers, invoke their contracts, and liquidate you without a second thought. The legal execution of a Hollywood asset is not a swift process. Once the gavel falls and the courtroom clears, the true agonizing machinery of corporate erasure begins. When Lizabeth Scott's defamation lawsuit against Confidential magazine ended in a mistrial in the fall of 1955, the immediate media circus dissolved. The reporters moved on to the next scandal. The public consumed the headlines and discarded the newspapers. But for Lizabeth Scott, the conclusion of the trial was merely the beginning of a highly organized, systemic quarantine designed to slowly choke the remaining life out of her professional existence. The mechanics of the Hollywood blacklist reveal the sheer brutality of her isolation. The moral blacklist was invisible. It left no paper trail. It was enforced through an unspoken gentleman's agreement among the men who controlled the major studios, an oligopoly that recognized a damaged asset and collectively agreed to refuse its service. When Paramount Pictures, under the explicit direction of Hal Wallis, invoked the Morals Clause and terminated Lizabeth Scott's contract, it sent a silent, high-voltage shockwave across the industry. The studio heads at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Warner Brothers, and 20th Century Fox observed the transaction. They saw that Hal Wallis, one of the most powerful producers in the world, had publicly severed ties with his own long-term mistress and top-tier leading lady. The message was unmistakable. Lizabeth Scott was contaminated. She was a liability. If the man who had built her career was willing to throw her to the wolves to protect his own marriage, no other studio executive was going to risk their own capital to salvage her. The quarantine was implemented with terrifying efficiency. Lizabeth Scott did not receive a formal letter stating she was banned from the industry. She simply stopped existing in the corporate ecosystem. Her talent agency, prioritizing its relationships with the major studios over the career of a single radioactive client, quietly stopped submitting her for leading roles. The screenplays that used to arrive at her home in towering stacks suddenly ceased. When she attempted to contact directors and producers who had previously praised her work and capitalized on her box office draw, she was intercepted by secretaries. Her calls were logged, but never returned. The doors of the Culver City and Burbank lots, which had once swung open at her approach, were permanently locked. This was the architecture of starvation. The studios did not need to actively destroy her anymore. They only needed to deny her the oxygen of employment. The financial reality of fighting a multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit against a predatory tabloid syndicate had severely depleted Lizabeth's personal capital. Confidential magazine was backed by a massive war chest designed specifically to bleed plaintiffs dry in court. Lizabeth had paid for her defense out of her own pocket, fighting a mechanized legal war without the financial umbrella of Paramount Pictures. Now stripped of her studio salary and blacklisted from future projects, the economic bleed accelerated. A Hollywood star in the 1950s carried immense overhead. They were required to maintain a specific standard of living to project the illusion of success. There were mortgages on Beverly Hills properties, retainers for publicists, and the exorbitant costs of wardrobe and maintenance. When the income stream is violently severed, the illusion rapidly collapses. The studio system relied on this financial pressure to crush insurgencies. They knew that a woman who could not pay her legal bills, WWs, would eventually be forced into submission or exile. As Lizabeth Scott languished in this corporate purgatory, Hal Wallis continued to operate at the absolute apex of the industry. The contrast between their respective fates exposes the core hypocrisy of the patriarchal studio hierarchy. Wallis suffered absolutely zero professional or social consequences for his involvement in the scandal, nor for his cowardly abandonment of the woman he had exploited for a decade. In the boardrooms of Hollywood, his actions were not viewed as a moral failure. They were viewed as sound crisis management. He had successfully excised a toxic asset and protected the core holdings of his corporation, his marriage to Louise Fazenda, and his production deal with Paramount. His masculinity was never questioned by his peers. In the ruthless logic of the syndicate, a man who sacrifices a mistress to save his empire is considered a pragmatist. While Wallis was demonstrating his absolute control over the industry, Louise Fazenda remained the silent, unmovable bedrock of his power. Fazenda's strategy of arrogant non-engagement had proven flawlessly effective. By refusing to acknowledge Lizabeth Scott's existence during the 10-year affair, and by remaining perfectly composed during the Confidential magazine scandal, Fazenda emerged completely unscathed. She did not grant the tabloids a single quote. She did not file for divorce. She did not demand a public apology from her husband. She understood that engaging in public warfare over a husband's infidelity reduces a wife to the level of the mistress. Fazenda operated on a higher corporate frequency. She maintained her iron grip on the family's real estate holdings, her philanthropic networks, and her social supremacy in Los Angeles. She allowed Wallis to manage the messy physical realities of the studio floor, while she managed the legacy of the dynasty. The marriage had successfully weathered the ultimate stress test. It proved that the wedding ring was an impenetrable shield, constructed of financial leverage and social class, capable of repelling any scandal. The homewrecker had been neutralized, liquidated, and erased from the ledger, while the wife retained the estate. Louise Fazenda held the absolute monopoly she had established in 1927 until her final breath. Hal Wallis inherited her vast fortune, seamlessly consolidating his power. The legacy of the savage betrayal is not merely the destruction of a single acting career. It is a precise historical documentation of how the Hollywood syndicate utilized the legal system, the media, and the mechanics of corporate blacklisting to enforce a rigid caste system. It proves that the studio machinery was a weapon that could be turned inward at a moment's notice to execute anyone who threatened the stability of the men at the top. Lizabeth Scott retreated into a fiercely guarded lifelong isolation. She disappeared into the sprawling anonymity of Los Angeles, a ghost haunting the city she once briefly ruled. She refused interviews. She rejected attempts by film historians to dissect her past. She built a wall around her life, perhaps recognizing that the only way to protect herself from further exploitation was to deny the world access to her existence entirely. But her story remains a permanent bloody stain on the pristine mythology of the Golden Age. It is the ultimate proof that behind the glamour, the lighting, and the billion-dollar box office returns, Hollywood was a slaughterhouse. The physical disappearance of a globally recognized motion picture star is a highly engineered process. It does not happen in a single dramatic moment. It is a slow, methodical asphyxiation executed by an entire industry acting in silent, ruthless consensus. When Lizabeth Scott was expelled from the Paramount lot, the corporate quarantine extended far beyond the studio gates. It permeated the entire social, economic, and psychological geography of Los Angeles. In the brute, hierarchy of Hollywood, a person's value is dictated entirely by their utility to power. Once Hal Wallis signaled that Lizabeth was stripped of his protection, she became a social contagion. The ecosystem of the city, the talent agents, the publicists, the maitre d's at exclusive restaurants like Chasen's and Romanoff's, operated on a strict radar of relevance and risk. When a blacklisted actress walks into a room, the room instantly calibrates to neutralize the threat. Former co-stars who had previously utilized her box office draw to boost their own careers suddenly looked the other way to avoid being photographed next to a legal liability. Directors who had once praised her cinematic magnetism suddenly suffered from total convenient amnesia. This is the anatomy of a living death. Lizabeth Scott remained biologically alive, but professionally and socially, she was a ghost. She was a woman forced to physically exist in the exact epicenter of the industry that had liquidated her. She owned property in the Hollywood Hills. Every day she looked down at the sprawling grid of Los Angeles, a city powered by the very studios that were currently and actively erasing her from their ledgers. She was trapped in a geographic prison, surrounded by the machinery of her own destruction. To endure this level of isolation requires a specific kind of psychological hardening. Lizabeth Scott had spent a decade operating in the shadows as Wallis's hidden asset. She was already accustomed to secrecy and compartmentalization, but the isolation of the blacklisted is fundamentally different from the isolation of the mistress. The mistress is hidden because she is valuable. The blacklisted actress is hidden because she is considered garbage. The industry demanded that she disappear quietly. The standard operating procedure for a discarded female star was to fade into alcoholism, accept a string of humiliating marriages, or descend into a highly publicized, tragic breakdown. The studios relied on these self-destructive spirals to justify their initial termination. If the actress destroyed herself, the executives could point to her demise and claim they had simply excised a mentally unstable employee. Lizabeth Scott refused to grant them that satisfaction. She denied the industry the spectacle of her collapse. She did not turn to the tabloids to sell salacious details about her decade with Hal Wallis. She did not engage in public feuds. She simply shut the door and fortified her perimeter. She understood that any public statement, any display of vulnerability would immediately be weaponized by the press to further humiliate her. She adopted a policy of absolute impenetrable silence. She locked herself away behind the gates of her residence, effectively enforcing her own quarantine before the industry could inflict any further damage upon her dignity. While Lizabeth was constructing her fortress of solitude, her executioner was experiencing a renaissance of unprecedented power and prestige. Hal Wallis did not suffer a tragic downfall. There was no karmic retribution for his supreme cowardice. Karma is a mythological concept invented to comfort the powerless. In the reality of the Hollywood syndicate, ruthlessness is rewarded with massive financial dividends. Following the death of Louise Fazenda, Wallis absorbed her vast, independently accumulated fortune. The real estate holdings, the investments, and the social capital that Fazenda had hoarded for decades transferred seamlessly to the man who had betrayed his mistress to secure them. Wallis was now a widower possessing immense consolidated wealth. He was unburdened by the physical presence of his formidable wife, yet he retained all the aristocratic armor her name provided. He utilized this capital to cement his legacy as one of the greatest producers in the history of cinema. He produced massive, critically acclaimed box office hits throughout the 1960s. He secured the film rights to prestigious theatrical productions like Anne of the Thousand Days and Beckett. He produced True Grit, securing an Academy Award for John Wayne. Wallis walked the red carpets at the Oscars. He was honored by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences with the Irving G. Thalberg Memorial Award, an irony so profound it borders on the grotesque, given that Wallis had utilized the exact same methods of female exploitation that Thalberg had pioneered. Wallis was celebrated at industry banquets. He was lauded in the trade papers as a visionary. He completely, successfully rewrote his own history. The men who sat beside him at these banquets, the executives who shook his hand and praised his cinematic genius, knew exactly what he had done to Lizabeth Scott. They knew about the decade-long affair. They knew about the sudden cowardly withdrawal of legal protection during the scandal. They knew he had invoked the morals clause to destroy her career, and they did not care. In the boardrooms of the major studios, Wallis's actions were not viewed as a moral failure. They were viewed as an exemplary demonstration of crisis management. He had successfully amputated a toxic, bleeding limb to save the corporate body. He had proven his ultimate loyalty to the bottom line. His peers respected him precisely because he demonstrated the capacity for absolute cold-blooded betrayal. The contrast between Wallis bathed in the spotlight of the Academy Awards and Lizabeth Scott sitting in the silence of her Hollywood Hills home exposes the fundamental gender disparity of the studio system's penal code. Men in Hollywood were permitted to survive scandals. They were permitted to engage in public affairs, commit financial fraud, and exhibit horrific personal behavior. The system always offered a mechanism for male rehabilitation. A powerful man could issue an apology, retreat to a European villa for 6 months, and return to find his production company waiting for him. The corporate machinery recognized male value as inherent and permanent. Female value was conditional and highly perishable. For a woman, a legal or moral scandal was a terminal diagnosis. Lizabeth Scott's ultimate crime against the syndicate was not the accusation printed in the tabloid. Her ultimate crime was her refusal to submit to the studio's execution protocol. By filing a $2.5 million defamation lawsuit against the magazine, she broke the cardinal rule of the Golden Age. She went to war without the permission of a CEO. The men who ran the studios feared unpredictability above all else. They required their assets to be entirely compliant. When Lizabeth walked into that courtroom, utilizing her own money to hire her own lawyers, she demonstrated agency. She proved she was willing to drag the ugly, hidden realities of Hollywood into the public record to defend her own name. The executives at Paramount and the surrounding studios looked at that lawsuit and saw a rogue operative. They realized she could not be controlled. A woman who fights back is a woman who threatens the stability of the entire oppressive structure. The blacklist was not just a punishment for the scandal, it was a punishment for her defiance. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, a strange parasitic phenomenon occurred regarding Lizabeth Scott's legacy. A new generation of film historians elevated the dark, cynical crime films of the 1940s into the realm of high art. The image of Lizabeth Scott was suddenly resurrected. The industry recognized her as the absolute zenith of the femme fatale archetype. They praised her heavily shadowed face, her gravelly voice, and her projection of lethal, calculating independence. The industry began to monetize her image once again. Her face was printed on retrospective movie posters. Her films were licensed to television networks and sold on home video formats. The studios generated new passive revenue streams, utilizing the exact same physical asset they had thrown into the gay era. Beige disposal 2 decades prior. But this resurrection was entirely restricted to celluloid. The woman herself remained exiled. The industry was perfectly willing to celebrate the image of Lizabeth Scott, but they had absolutely no intention of employing the human being. The directors of the new Hollywood era, men who idolized the noir films she had starred in, did not offer her roles. The blacklist had functioned so perfectly, so quietly, that her absence from the screen was simply accepted as a natural fact of cinematic history. She was treated as a historical artifact rather than a living, breathing artist capable of performing. She watched from the sidelines as the culture commodified her youth. She saw her face utilized to sell a genre of film defined by betrayal, manipulation, and the destruction of men. The irony was staggering. She was being celebrated as a fictional destroyer of men while living the reality of a woman who had been utterly destroyed by them. The preservation of her image while her physical reality was starved is the final insult of the Hollywood machine. The corporation retains the right to profit from the ghost long after they have executed the body. Lizabeth Scott spent her final decades engaged in a relentless, exhausting campaign of privacy. She turned down lucrative offers to write a memoir. She understood that publishing a book would require her to reopen the wounds of the decade-long affair and the subsequent betrayal. She knew that the publishers did not want a book about her acting technique. They wanted a book about Hal Wallis, the tabloid scandal, and the humiliation. She refused to allow her trauma to be packaged and sold as entertainment. She refused to grant the public the access that the studio had violently revoked. She lived an exceptionally quiet, regimented life. She volunteered for various charities operating entirely under the radar. She protected her perimeter with the vigilance of a military commander. She outlived Hal Wallis. She outlived the men who had cross-examined her in the courtroom. She outlived the publishers of the tabloid that had initiated her ruin. When the obituaries were published, the major news outlets led with her status as the ultimate femme fatale. They praised her beauty and her contribution to the noir genre. They briefly, vaguely mentioned that her career had ended prematurely due to a lack of good roles. They sanitized the narrative. They erased the mechanics of her destruction. They refused to name the cowardice of the production chief who abandoned her, the complicity of the studio that fired her, and the systemic misogyny of the industry that blacklisted her. They preferred the myth. The myth is clean. The myth allows the audience to watch the films without acknowledging the blood required to produce them. The men who discarded her eventually faded, but the historical record remains a testament to the absolute savagery of the Golden Age. It stands as a clinical demonstration of how a patriarchal industry isolates, extracts, and discards its female assets. Lizabeth Scott was a casualty of a war she was never equipped to win. She was a woman who tried to survive in a system designed exclusively for the benefit of the men who owned the cameras and the wives who owned the men. But the Hollywood machine did not stop functioning after it destroyed Lizabeth Scott. The executives in the boardrooms of Culver City and Burbank simply adapted. They analyzed the fallout of the defamation lawsuit and the messy public nature of the scandal. They realized that utilizing the legal system to discipline female assets was inefficient. It drew too much attention. It exposed the ugly transactional reality of the industry to the public. The studio system needed a more efficient method of control. They needed a way to completely neutralize the negotiating power of the female star before she ever had the chance to demand respect or legal protection. The studios extended the air control beyond contracts, utilizing amphetamines and barbiturates to dictate the physical stamina and emotional states of their leading ladies. The age of the dark, smoky femme fatale was over. The era of the manufactured, highly medicated blonde commodity had begun. At 20th Century Fox, the executives faced a massive crisis. Their most lucrative asset, a woman who generated unprecedented global revenue, had suddenly realized her own worth. She began demanding script approval. She demanded higher salaries. She demanded to be treated as an artist rather than a piece of talking meat. She attempted to unionize her own body against the corporation. The studio executives refused to negotiate. They decided to demonstrate that she was not unique. They decided to prove that her image could be replicated on an assembly line. The studio scoured the country and found a replacement. They engineered her. They bleached her hair to the exact same shade. They instructed her to mimic the exact same breathy vocal cadence. They pumped her full of the exact same physical measurements. They weaponized this new woman, using her to publicly humiliate and devalue their primary star. They created a living, breathing threat to crush the original asset's leverage. But a human being cannot sustain the pressure of being a corporate copy without chemical intervention. The studio doctors became the new enforcers. They distributed amphetamines to force these women to work 18-hour days under the blistering studio lights. They distributed heavy barbiturates to knock them out when their anxieties threatened to halt production. The women were trapped in a pharmaceutical loop, their biology hijacked to maximize shooting schedules and corporate profits. This was not a rivalry. It was a game of replacement orchestrated by men who viewed women as easily interchangeable spare parts. And this experiment ended in two of the most tragic deaths of the 20th century. One woman died alone, face down, clutching a telephone in a locked bedroom, her system overloaded with the very chemicals the industry had provided to keep her compliant. The other woman died violently, suffering fatal head trauma, crushed under the metal of a tractor trailer on a dark, fog-choked Louisiana highway, a discarded novelty act still desperately touring to pay the bills long after the studio had thrown her away. Both were casualties of a system that decided human life was secondary to market share. The destruction of Lizabeth Scott marked the end of the noir era, but the studio system merely adapted its methods. In the 1950s, control shifted from legal contracts to chemical dependency, setting the stage for the manufactured rivalry between Marilyn Monroe and Jane Mansfield.